Does this image look familiar to anyone? A red book on a desk, just like the start screen when you turn on Pokémon Scarlet. When I first saw this image, I was gooped, but not as gooped as I would be when I read more details about Carl Jung's The Red Book and his book titled Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. The book in this image is literally titled The Red Book, and I have never heard anyone mention the connection between Carl Jung's The Red Book and Heath's Scarlet book. Just like I seem to have been the one to discover the connection between Heath and real-world U.S. Navy Admiral Richard E. Byrd, which, if you have not seen, is detailed in the first video of this series. In this series, I am proposing that there is a deep, esoteric, and occult message behind Pokémon Scarlet and Violet that is unveiled through the heaps of parallels between Heath's story, the lore of the games, the missing diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the works of Carl Jung, the works of Plato, and so much more. So let's turn another page and unveil connections other than the obvious, being that both of these books are named after their shades of red, because there are many, many explanations to Pokemon to be found throughout the works of Carl Jung. In this video, I'll be putting forth all new theories about Heath, the professors, the fruit-themed academies, the Scarlet Book, Koraidon, and Miraidon, the mysterious four circles with arrows pointing in a counterclockwise direction, the disc Pokemon, Terra Crystals, the Time Machine, AZ's weapon, the prevalence of sci-fi subjects, the Psychic type, Paradox Pokemon, the Ruinous Pokemon, Gimmighoul, Diplin, Herba Mystica, and the hidden treasure of Area Zero. So let's get into it. Carl Jung, who was a highly respected and awarded individual, who I found out had an alleged or mythical expedition to the Arctic with 3 dogs and his close human companion at the time, Sigmund Freud. The expedition really just seems to be an internet myth, but it dates as far back as 13 years ago from what I could find. And you never know, it could have actually happened outside of this fake account of the tale. Plus, the fact versus fiction element to that story adds to its parallels with Heath's. All of the other historical figures of Earth from this series definitely went on an expedition, but we continue. As evidenced in many of his books and on his Wikipedia page, what was not mythical was that Carl Jung did have confrontation with the unconscious.
He saw visions and heard voices. He worried at times that he was menaced by a psychosis or was doing a schizophrenia. He decided that it was a valuable experience, and in private, he included hallucinations, or, in his words, a process of active imagination. He recorded everything he experienced in small journals, which Jung referred to in the singular as his Black Book, considering it a single integral whole. Around 1915, Jung commissioned a large red leather-bound book and began to transcribe his notes along with painting, working intermittently for 16 years. Jung left no posthumous instructions about the final disposition of what he called the Liber Novus, or Red Book. Sonu Shamdasani, a historian of psychology from London, tried for 3 years to persuade Jung's resistant heirs to have it published. Ulrich Horney, Jung's grandson who manages the Jung archives, decided to publish it when the necessary additional funds needed were raised through the Philemon Foundation. Up to September 2008, fewer than about 24 people had ever seen it. According to Sarah Corbett, reviewing the text for the New York Times,
the book is bombastic, baroque, and like so much else about Carl Jung, a willful oddity, cinched with an antediluvian and mystical reality.
So the book has a lot of extravagant claims, which many people believe to be false. Sonu also parallels Heath and the professors picking up where he left off, as Sonu is a historian who picked up where Carl Jung left off and got the Red Book published. Another parallel with the professors and Carl Jung's The Red Book is that Carl Jung wrote the Red Book during a period of time after the bitter end of his relationship with Sigmund Freud. This brings to mind the bitter end of the relationship relationship between the professors themselves and what partakes in their story after one leaves the other in Scarlet and Violet respectively. Sarah Corbett even references antediluvian times, or times before the catastrophe of the Great Flood, which brings to mind the recovering ancient civilization of Paldea. For the sake of the speed of getting this video out, I have not done a deep dive into any translation of Carl Jung's The Red Book, but let me know in the comments if this is something you'd be interested in seeing another video on, or if you have anything from The Red Book to contribute to the conversation here. You could say this is where Carl Jung's own personal story falls off from having parallels with Heath's, and that the other historical figures I'm reviewing in this series have comparatively more biographic parallels. However, there's another book by Carl Jung that provides many more clues. Like, have you ever wondered why aliens and sci-fi themes are so prevalent in these games' lore? It makes sense with how increasingly relevant UFOs are in the news as the years go by, and with blatant references to real-world US Navy Admiral Richard E. Byrd's story of encountering UFOs right after World War II. But wait, there's more. This book by Carl Jung further explains the story of Scarlet and Violet, and is titled Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. The cover brings Gimmighoul to mind with those golden yellow eyes, and saucers, of course, are a reference to a disc shape. So with Carl Jung, we already have a red book, and now a book about discs? And in this book, we find the specific word discs mentioned 23 times in reference to these flying objects. At some points, the book discusses events from World War II, including the Foo Fighters, which is not only very relevant for Japan, but also brings more references to the first video in this series on Admiral Richard E. Byrd. The main thesis Carl Jung makes is that UFOs are psychological projections from the unconscious mind or hallucinations of the imagination, which immediately reminds us of the biggest debate going on in the Pokémon community right now, whether Paradox Pokémon are real or imaginary. Carl Jung eventually explains that psychological projections are both imaginary and real, random and intelligent, and even mentions parallelism. All of these options were listed in a leaker's poll of possible explanations for Paradox Pokémon, and I believe all of them to be true. Carl Jung and Plato help us to confirm this. But first, to start, here is a passage from Carl Jung's book explaining that he believes UFOs are psychological projections.
If we close our eyes a little so as to overlook certain details, it is possible to side with the reasonable opinion of the majority in whose name Dr. Dryden speaks, and to regard the thousands of UFO reports and the uproar they have created as a visionary rumor to be treated accordingly. They would then boil down, objectively, to an admittedly impressive collection of mistaken observations and conclusions into which subjective psychic assumptions have been projected. But if it is a case of psychological projection, there must be a psychic cause for it.
The reason he proposes is a fear of war and the apocalypse, creating a need for a messiah from the heavens. In situations like these, Carl Jung writes,
In just these cases, the unconscious has to resort to particularly drastic measures in order to make its contents perceived. It does this most vividly by projection, by extrapolating its contents into an object, which then reflects back what had previously lain hidden in the unconscious. Projection can be observed at work everywhere, in mental illness, in ideas of persecution and hallucinations, in so-called normal people who see the mote in their brother's eye without seeing the beam in their own, and finally, in extreme form, in political propaganda.
There's an interesting reference to projecting onto objects during times of distress in there that brings to mind the ruinous Pokémon as ruinous objects. He also speaks of reflections, which reminds one of the reflective quality of the Terra crystals, and he goes on explaining the concept and how it can apply to a collective consciousness with this interesting talk of secret societies.
Projections have what we might call different ranges, according to whether they stem from merely personal conditions or from deeper collective ones. Personal repressions and things of which we are unconscious manifest themselves in our immediate environment, in our circle of relatives and acquaintances. Collective contents, such as religious, philosophical, political, and social conflicts, select projection carriers of a corresponding kind: Freemasons, Jesuits, Jews, capitalists, Bolsheviks, imperialists, etc. In the threatening situation of the world today, when people are beginning to see that everything is at stake, the projection creating fantasy soars beyond the realm of earthly organizations and powers into the heavens, into interstellar space, where the rulers of human fate, the gods, once had their abode in the planets. Our earthly world is split into two halves.
Okay. More mentions of atomic explosions triggering the collective consciousness and threatening to cause a cataclysm. Next, we have more questioning of fact versus fiction, history versus myth, scientific versus paranormal, etc. And specifically in relation to advanced disk technology, as Carl Jung writes,
The UFOs themselves, however, do not appear to have been impressed. As the latest observations show, they continue their way undeterred. Be that as it may, one thing is certain, they have become a living myth. We have here a golden opportunity of seeing how a legend is formed, and how in a difficult and dark time for humanity a miraculous tale grows up of an attempted intervention by extraterrestrial heavenly powers, and this at the very time when human fantasy is seriously considering the possibility of space travel and of visiting or even invading other planets. We on our side want to fly to the moon or to Mars, and on their side, the inhabitants of other planets in our system, or even of the fixed stars, want to fly to us. We at least are conscious of our space-conquering aspirations, but that a corresponding extraterrestrial tendency exists is a purely mythological conjecture, i.e., a projection. Sensationalism, love of adventure, technological audacity, intellectual curiosity may appear to be sufficient motives for our futuristic fantasies. But the impulse to spin such fantasies, especially when they take such a serious form, witness the Sputnik springs from an underlying cause, namely a situation of distress and the vital need that goes with it. It could easily be conjectured that the Earth is growing too small for us, that humanity would like to escape from its prison, where we are threatened not only by the hydrogen bomb, but at a still deeper level, by the prodigious increase in the population figures, which give cause for serious concern.
Okay, wow, this is all a lot, but it will all become increasingly relevant. Notice the mentioning of the hydrogen bomb, which not only reminds us of AZ's weapon, the disasters caused by the ruinous Pokémon, and the war of the Poké World, but also of the tragedy that befell the nation that is creating these very games on our Earth, Japan. He continues about disc-shaped UFOs.
In this case, they are to be regarded as symbols representing, in visual form, some thought that was not thought consciously, but is merely potentially present in the unconscious and invisible form, and attains visibility only through the process of becoming conscious. The visible form, however, expresses the meaning of the unconscious content only approximately.
So something that comes out of the unconscious and interacts with light in a new visible form that only looks approximately like what was imagined? Could this be a description that perfectly syncs up with how the Paradox Pokémon were brought into the Pokéworld as well as the terrestrialization phenomena? Heath himself wrote that light itself could be the guardian said to watch over treasure deep within the crater in his Scarlet book. Light is also a concept tied to many statements made in the games about subjects from terrestrial crystals, Esparta's powers, necrozma, and on. I could go on, but the point is that countless statements in many different Pokemon games revolve around light. Referring to the same concept of approximate vision from the unconscious, much later in the book, Carl Jung writes,
The four-dimensional background is a vision, in the dual sense of seeing and of something seen. It seems to be a matter of pure chance that it has turned out so, and not otherwise, when the merest accident could have given it a quite different appearance.
This also reads as a blatant description of the Paradox Pokémon, which look kind of as one would expect them to, but then also not. Also, the description of the four-dimensional background brings to mind the backgrounds in Terra battles being the reflections of the Terra crystals. Mirrors themselves allow one to be seeing and to be seen at the same time. Carl Jung goes on to suggest that the reason for the UFOs existing in the object or form that they do is because the disc, sphere, or circular shape is linked to divinity deep in our subconscious and throughout all cultures. This is true about these shapes and brings up two of my favorite subjects, sacred geometry and Plato. Anyone who is interested in sacred geometry or Plato may be interested to hear all that unfolds in this video and in the next one of this series, which will be about Plato's inspiration in the Pokémon Scarlet and Violet lore. Most people don't seem to realize how relevant sacred geometry and the ideas of Plato are in so many aspects of our culture, and that's exactly why I plan to continue discussing these subjects on my channel. This image is one I was inspired to design and illustrate by Pokémon, and all of these archetypal concepts of essences discussed by Carl Jung, Plato, and so many more. These are very occult and esoteric subjects relating to astrology, alchemy, and sacred geometry as well. It's also my take on the Scarlet book, and by the way, I didn't use AI to create it. It combines the symbol for Phi with the symbol for the sun to create the Pokeball, which, if you add a couple of leaves and slices to, looks like the orange of Naranja Academy. Then we have the mane of Solgaleo, the wings of Scarlet's Paradox Pokémon Roaring Moon, and at the corners of the book's design we have Solrock, of course, to round out our solar and Pokémon symbology. I did use AI, however, to create these images, which I then photoshopped to look like my Scarlet book design like this. This was my first time using AI, and it is yet another truly relevant topic included in these games. I hope these images are helpful in illustrating the concepts at hand and that you enjoy them. More on the Rainbow books later. But back to flying discs. This whole portion is very interesting, reminds me a lot of Arceus lore, and I highly suggest it as a good read. It talks about God being a circle whose center is everywhere, and epiphanies are associated with fire and light. During an explanation of the symbol of the circle, the sun wheel and alchemy are mentioned, which is interesting because many have pointed out a great deal of alchemy, not only throughout Poke lore, but also from many animes and a lot of content coming out of Japan. The sun symbol, alongside Phi, has been theorized to be the inspiration for the Pokeball, thus involved in the meaning of all of Pokemon itself. This is no news to the Pokemon community. I believe this is mostly thanks to YouTuber Loxton and Noggin, who I would love to send a shout out, credit, and some love to. I would definitely recommend his channel. At this point, I would like to add Carl Jung's words about the Sun Cross.
If the UFOs were living organisms, one would think of a swarm of insects rising with the sun, not to fight one another but to mate and celebrate the marriage flight. Here the cross signifies a union of opposites, vertical and horizontal. A crossing. As a plus sign, it is also a joining together and addition. Where the globes are coupled together to form fraternities, they have given rise to the cross marriage fraternio, which I have discussed in my Psychology of the Transference. It forms the model for the primitive cross-cousin marriage, but is also an individuation symbol, the union of the four.
This is a concept of divine masculine and feminine. The male vertical line intersects with the female horizontal line to create a cross in the self and in the year, dividing it into 4 seasons. And it just so happens that these games are the first in the franchise to have a male and female professor who also happen to have a child together that becomes the most significant character in the plot. Interestingly enough, these games also come to us at a time when gender has become such a dominant discussion all around our real world. More on the divine masculine, Carl Jung even talks about spears as a symbol of such, which relates back to the Ruinous Pokemon and parts 1 and 2 of this series discussing the Spear of Destiny. Mandalas also come into relation to these aspects of circles and unions of 4.
UFOs seem to me to have a good deal in common with mandala symbolism, about which I first wrote in 1927, in The Secret of the Golden Flower. Insofar as the mandala encompasses, protects, and defends the psychic totality against outside influences and seeks to unite the inner opposites, it is at the same time a distinct individuation symbol and was known as such even to medieval alchemy. The soul was supposed to have the form of a sphere, on the analogy of Plato's world soul, and we meet the same symbol in modern dreams. This symbol, by reason of its antiquity, leads us to the heavenly spheres, to Plato's supercelestial place where the ideas of all things are stored up. Hence, there would be nothing against the naive interpretation of UFOs as souls. Naturally, they do not represent our modern conception of the psyche. but give an involuntary archetypal or mythological picture of an unconscious content, or rotundum, as the alchemists called it, that expresses the totality of the individual. I have defined this spontaneous image as a symbolical representation of the self, by which I mean not the ego but the totality composed of the conscious and the unconscious. In other words, the rounded wholeness of the mandala becomes a spaceship controlled by an intelligent being.
So mandalas therefore are linked to a lot of themes relating to duality, inner opposites, consciousness and the unconscious, disc and sphere-shaped UFOs, alchemy, Plato, and antiquity. Insanity. Their name has also been incorporated into the mandala effect, a theory about parallel universes intersecting, which myself, Poke theorists, and many of the games in the franchise themselves propose is a phenomena existing in the Pokemon universe. The circle also represents psychic totality or wholeness, and considering psychic types have always been an important part of the game, that seems relevant. The word psychic is written many times throughout the book. Then Carl Jung explains the coexistence and evolution of a UFO shape from sphere to disc, and notice what he writes about monsters and automobiles.
The individual soul was thought to be of heavenly origin, particle of the world soul, and hence a microcosm, a reflection of the macrocosm. Leibniz's monadology is an eloquent example of this. The macrocosm is the starry world around us, which, appearing to the naive mind as spherical, gives the soul its traditional spherical form. Actually, the astronomical heavens are filled with mainly lens-shaped agglomerations of stars, the galaxies, similar in form to that of the UFOs. This form may possibly be a concession to the recent astronomical findings, for to my knowledge there are no older traditions that speak of the soul having the form of a lens. Here we may have an instance of an older tradition being modified by recent additions to knowledge, and influencing of primordial ideas by the latest acquisitions of consciousness, like the frequent substitution of automobiles and airplanes for animals and monsters in modern dreams.
Substitution of automobiles and airplanes for animals and monsters? I feel like the designs of Cyclizar, Koraidon, and Miraidon being so similar to automobiles serves not only as a game mechanic to get the player around, but also as a direct reference to this quote in this book. Yep. There we have it. Beasts as automobiles and airplanes. Part of the inspiration for the box legendaries revealed. This book and Admiral Richard E. Byrd's flight story is part of the inspiration for the box legendaries and the opening sequence of the games with Koraidon or Miraidon crashing. This passage also has themes of past versus future, as it depicts the evolution of the sphere into the disc, as well as our methods of transportation evolving from that of animals and monsters into automobiles and airplanes, just like the themes of the past in Scarlet and the future in Violet. There is of course more inspiration for them that other creators have discovered, as the Pokemon creators pack a lot into their designs. However, I will be revealing yet another new theory I have for the designs of Koraidon and Miraidon later in this video and series that I have not heard anyone else discussing. Like, why are they serpents? The very next thing Carl Jung writes is also very Pokemon-y, relating to biology and suggesting that there is indeed a divine link between the disc shape and the elements composing space. This almost sounds like a description of the meaning behind Terapagos itself, and it mentions many animals that have already been made into Pokemon.
Absolute knowledge occurs not only in telepathy and precognition, but also in biology. For instance, in the attunement of the virus of hydrophobia to the anatomy of dog and man as described by Portman, the wasp's apparent knowledge of where the motor ganglia are located in the caterpillar that is to nourish the wasp's progeny, the emission of light by certain fishes and insects with almost 100% efficiency, the directional sense of carrier pigeons, the warning of earthquakes given by chickens and cats, and the amazing cooperation found in symbiotic relationships. We know, too, that the life process itself cannot be explained only by causality, but requires intelligent choice. The shape of the UFOs is in this sense analogous to that of the elements composing the structure of space, the galaxies, no matter how ridiculous this seems to human reason.
And once again, soon after this, he mentions another parallel from Pokémon Scarlet and Violet when he agrees with Sigmund Freud that the UFO being disc-shaped could give it a phallic symbolism that would suggest it is fructifying, which means to make fruitful or productive. The Academy in each game has a symbol of a fruit, and their goal seems to be to provide fruitful information that makes their students productive, much like the symbol of the UFO, according to Carl Jung and the goal of Heath's expedition. Heath's book even says they hope to foster future generations of scholars and scientists. There's also that part in Heath's Scarlet book about the wondrous fruits in Area Zero. There's this little part about water and the eye being of white and blue, which could relate to Blueberry Academy and the Indigo Disc. We'll have to wait to find out on that one, but it also totally sounds like a description of the cloudy image of Paldea.
The eye is half blue, half white. This corresponds to the colors of the sky, its pure blue, and the whiteness of clouds that obscure its transparency.
Later in the book, this passage drew some parallels to Heath's story.
Modern man still does not realize that he is entirely dependent on the cooperation of the unconscious, which can actually cut short the very next sentence he proposes to speak. He is unaware that he is continuously sustained by something, while all the time he regards himself exclusively as the doer. He depends on and is sustained by an entity he does not know, but of which he has intimations that occur to, or, as we can more fitly say, revealed themselves to long-forgotten forebears in the gray dawn of history. Whence did they come? Obviously from the unconscious processes, from that so-called unconscious which still precedes consciousness in every new human life.
This seems to be inspiration for Heath's later journal entries when he has an unconscious encounter with the disc entity that literally cuts his sentences short and causes the page to be filled with errors. Funnily enough, the book Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies appears to have been published many times, and each time Carl Jung appears to have found another story to add to the epilogue. Each of these stories draws more parallels to Heath, the professors, and more elements of the stories of Scarlet and Violet. So let's get into the epilogue. Carl Jung references another book titled The Secret of the Saucers by Orfeo M. Angelucci. This particular story is interesting because it tells of a man who has an encounter with highly advanced intelligent beings through two disc-shaped glowing red lights, already bringing to mind many of the main aspects of Heath's story. Along with these discs, the inciting incident includes this description.
Suddenly, the area between them began to glow with a soft green light which gradually formed into a luminous three-dimensional screen. In it, there appeared the heads and shoulders of two persons, a man and a woman, being the ultimate of perfection. They had large, shining eyes, and despite their supernatural perfection, they seemed strangely familiar to him. It seemed to him that he was in telepathic communication with them.
So right off the bat, we have symbolism of a divine masculine and a divine feminine. There's telepathic communication going on, like Heath's telepathic contact with an entity. These unidentified beings projecting through discs say they are interested in helping benefit the future of humanity because of an ancient kinship their planet has with ours. They have seen our species' growing pains, seemingly referencing wars and calamities, and they refer to themselves as our older brothers, implying that their species is older or more ancient than ours. Then there's this passage.
On July 23, 1952, he felt unwell and stayed away from work. In the evening, he took a walk, and on the way back, in a lonely place, similar sensations came over him as he had felt on May 23. Combined with them was the dulling of consciousness I had noted on that other occasion, i.e., the awareness of an abaissement du niveau mental, a state which is a very important precondition for the occurrence of spontaneous psychic phenomena. Suddenly, he saw a luminous object on the ground before him, like an igloo or a huge, misty soap bubble. This object visibly increased in solidity, and he saw something like a doorway leading into a brightly lit interior. He stepped inside and found himself in a vaulted room, about 18 feet in diameter. The walls were made of some ethereal mother-of-pearl stuff. Facing him was a comfortable reclining chair consisting of the same translucent, shimmering substance. Otherwise, the room was empty and silent. He sat down and had the feeling that he was suspended in air. It was as if the chair molded itself to the shape of his body of its own accord. The door shut as if there had never been a door there at all. Then he heard a kind of humming, a rhythmical sound like a vibration, which put him into a kind of semi-dream state. The room grew dark, and music came from the walls. Then it grew light again. He found on the floor a piece of metal like a coin. When he took it in his hand, it seemed to diminish in size. He had the feeling that the UFO was carrying him away. Suddenly, something like a round window opened, about 9 feet in diameter. Outside, he saw a planet, the Earth, from a distance of over 1,000 miles, as a voice he recognized explained to him. He wept with emotion, and the voice said, "Weep, Orfeo, we weep with you for Earth and her children. For all its apparent beauty, Earth is a purgatorial world among the planets evolving intelligent life. Hate, selfishness, and cruelty rise from many parts of it like a dark mist." Then, he says, the craft evidently moved out into cosmic space. Through the window, he saw a UFO about 1,000 feet long and 90 feet thick, consisting of a transparent crystalline substance. Music poured from it, bringing visions of harmoniously revolving planets and galaxies. The voice informed him that every being on Earth was divinely created, and upon your world the mortal shadows of those entities are working out their salvation from the plane of darkness. All these entities were either on the good side or on the bad. "We know where you stand, Orfeo." Owing to his physical weakness, he had spiritual gifts, and that was why the heavenly beings could enter into communication with him. He was given to understand that the music as well as the voice emanated from this huge spaceship.
Quite an intriguing little tale right there, with so many parallels to Scarlet and Violet. The walls are made of some ethereal mother of pearl stuff, like Terra crystals and the Time Machine room. We have a reference to coins, like Gimme Ghoul and the Suit of Pentacles and tarot cards. An empty room with just a master. Moral debates of good or bad. Villains and good guys. Entering into communication with heavenly beings. It goes on to mention Jesus as a being of the sun or Lord of the Flame, going back to the link of Pokemon's main symbol of the Pokeball being a reference to solar symbolism. It also goes on to mention time and a time dimension in a couple of interesting excerpts that relate back to Heath's luminous conscious and unconscious experience with an intelligent entity.
Everyone on Earth has a spiritual, unknown self which transcends the material world in consciousness and dwells eternally outside of the time dimension in spiritual perfection within the unity of the Oversoul. The sole purpose of human existence on Earth is to attain reunion with the immortal consciousness.
And
Beloved friend of Earth, we baptize you now in the true light of the world's eternal. A white flash of lightning blazed forth. His life lay clear before his eyes, and the remembrance of all his previous existences came back to him. He understood the mystery of life. He thought he was going to die, for he knew that at this moment he was wafted into eternity, into a timeless sea of bliss.
this also sounds like the ethereal realm that people of the Pokemon community describe as the location of the disc Pokemon or Terrapagos. Could this be an explanation for what happened to the professors? And harkens to the ocean with its description including Sea of Bliss. The white flash of lightning bringing the revelation to the main character brings to mind Miraidon, Jupiter, Zeus, Thor, and Pikachu's electricity assisting the main character in the beginning of the anime. It also connects to Carl Jung's passages correlating light with knowledge and divinity. The main character attains the mystery of life, which is thematically similar to the idea of the hidden treasure of Area Zero. A worm is mentioned in this excerpt.
Under the searching eye of this great compassionate consciousness, Orfeo felt like a crawling worm, unclean, filled with error and sin.
And now we get yet another coin and sun symbolism, but now also referencing a hydrogen atom responsible for the hydrogen bomb, which, as we've already discussed in this video, is unfortunately very relevant.
Afterwards, on going to bed, he noticed a burning sensation on the left side of his chest. There he found a stigma the size of a 25-cent piece, an inflamed circle with a dot in the middle. He interpreted this as the symbol of the hydrogen atom.
During this tale, crystals are mentioned 2 other times. Once, when the beings manifest a crystal cup, perhaps like a holy grail. Upon drinking from it, Orpheus said it was the most delicious beverage he had ever tasted, and it made him feel refreshed and strengthened. Which reminds one of Terra Crystals, Herba Mystica, the Holy Grail, and weirdly enough, Admiral Richard E. Byrd's contact story from the Missing Diaries of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, which also has him drinking an unusually delicious, unknown drink in a crystal city. And another time, crystals are referenced when they tell him that they have recording crystal discs that record vital statistics of every man, woman, and child of Earth because they care about us so much. There's also another whole portion involving the god Neptune, which is really interesting and perhaps related to Scarlet, Violet, Blueberry Academy, and the Indigo Disc DLC. We'll have to wait and see. Next up in the epilogue, there's a poem titled Vision that sounds like a description of Chiyu and could be part of the inspiration for so many fish Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. It references vision, light, blue pools, the fish's eyes, jewels, a disc, the sun, and moon.
Light strikes the pebbled bottom of a deep blue pool. Through swaying grass, a jewel flickers, gleams, and turns, demands attention as I pause. A staring fish eye's glance attracts my mind and heart. The fish, invisible as glass. A shimmering silver moon. The fish, assuming shape and form, evolves a whirling, swirling dance, intensity of light increasing. The disc becomes a blazing golden sun, compelling deeper contemplation.
And then we have another story time from the epilogue of Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies by Carl Jung. That is a fruit of too much juiciness to occult any further by rewording it in my own words. It's from a book by Fred Hoyle titled The Black Cloud. I didn't want to lengthen this portion of the video any further, but this story has far too many parallels to not include it, as Carl Jung himself concurs and adds it to the epilogue in a later publication.
A young astronomer at the Mount Palomar Observatory, while looking for supernovae to the south of Orion, discovers a dark circular patch in a dense field of stars. It is a so-called globulus, a dark cloud of gas, which, it transpires, is moving towards our solar system. At the same time, in England, considerable disturbances are detected in the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. The cause of this is calculated by a Cambridge mathematician, the hero of our story, to be a definite mass which, it then turns out, is located exactly at the spot where the Americans discovered the black cloud. This globulus, whose diameter is approximately equal to the distance of the Sun from the Earth, consists of hydrogen of fairly high density and is moving straight towards the Earth at 40 miles a second. It will reach the Earth in about 18 months. As the black cloud gets nearer, it causes first of all a turbo heat that kills off a large part of the life on Earth. This is followed by a total extinction of light and a more than Egyptian darkness lasting for about a month, a grado like that described in the Aurora Consurgens, a treatise ascribed to St. Thomas Aquinas. Beholding from afar, I saw a great cloud looming black over all the earth, which had absorbed the earth and covered my soul. When the light reappears again, there follows a period of turbo cold, which causes another appalling catastrophe. Meanwhile, the scientists in question have been shut up by the British government in their experimental location where, thanks to the security measures they have taken, they survive the catastrophes. By observing certain remarkable ionization phenomena in the atmosphere, they come to the conclusion that these are intentionally induced, and that in consequence there must be an intelligent agent in the black cloud. By means of radio, they succeed in entering into communication with it and receive answers. They learn that the cloud is 500 million years old and is at present engaged in regenerating itself. It has taken up its position near the sun in order to recharge itself with energy. In fact, it is feeding on the sun. The scientists discover that the cloud must eliminate all radioactive substances, as these are harmful to it. This fact is also discovered by the American observers, and at their instigation, the cloud is fired at with H-bombs with the intention of killing it. The cloud, meanwhile, is settled in a disk around the sun, consequently threatening the Earth every 6 months with eclipses of several weeks' duration. The English naturally have a host of questions to ask the cloud, including the metaphysical question concerning a greater being of still greater age and even deeper wisdom and scientific knowledge. The cloud replies that it has already discussed the matter with other globuli, but is as much in the dark about it as human beings. It is willing, however, to communicate its own greater knowledge directly to mankind. The young physicist declares himself ready to submit to the experiment. He gets into a hypnotic condition, but dies of a sort of inflammation of the brain before being able to make any communication. The Cambridge mathematician of genius now offers himself for experiment on the condition, accepted by the cloud, that the process of communication shall take place very much more slowly. In spite of that, he falls into a delirium which ends in his death. The cloud, however, has decided to quit the solar system and seek out another region of fixed stars. The sun emerges again from obscurity and everything is as before, except for the tremendous destruction of earthly life.
Okay, so yeah, a lot again. But essentially we're getting the same story over and over again from these characters having these dreamy, luminous encounters with intelligent beings. We got observatories or bases, a science-oriented hero, contact with an ancient intelligent disk cloud entity of hydrogen, H-bombs, an alchemic reference, light, suppression of scientists in experimental locations, the disk forming around the sun, a solar energy image creating an eclipse. This also brings to mind Poké theories about Terapagos existing in an alternate dimension to gather energy to return to this one. Carl Jung thinks this story is especially interesting because he believes the author is otherwise a scientific man of astronomy who resorted to science fiction for this book, which once again also relates back to a lot of the fact versus fiction themes in Scarlet and Violet. By the way, Carl Jung has a lot of interpretations of these stories, which I highly recommend you read for yourself, but most notably of the Black Cloud, Carl Jung writes,
It is not difficult to see that the author has here taken up the UFO problem so characteristic of our epoch. From outer space, a round object approaches the Earth and causes a worldwide catastrophe. Although the legend usually considers the catastrophic political situation, or rather nuclear fission, to be the indirect cause of the UFO phenomenon, there are not a few people who suspect that the real danger lies in the appearance of UFOs themselves, namely an invasion of the Earth by star dwellers, which might give an unexpected and probably undesirable turn to our already questionable situation. The strange idea that the Black Cloud possesses a sort of nervous system and a psyche or intelligence to match is not an original invention of the authors, since speculative ufologists have already arrived at the hypothesis of a sentient electrical field, and also at the idea that the UFOs are provisioning themselves with something on Earth: water, oxygen, small organisms, etc., just as the cloud charged itself with solar energy. The cloud causes opposite extremes of temperature and an absolute nigredo such as the old alchemists dreamed of. This illustrates a characteristic aspect of the psychological problem which arises when the light of day consciousness is directly confronted with night, the collective unconscious. Opposites of extreme intensity collide with one another, causing a disorientation and darkening of consciousness, which can assume threatening proportions, as in the initial stage of a psychosis. This aspect, i.e., the analogy with a psychic catastrophe, is depicted by Hoyle as the encounter between the psychic content of the cloud and the consciousness of the two unfortunate victims. Just as earthly life is largely wiped out by the collision with the cloud, so the psyche and the life of the two scientists are destroyed by the collision with the unconscious. For although the rotundum is a totality symbol, it usually encounters a consciousness that is not prepared for it and does not understand it. Indeed, is bound to misunderstand it and therefore cannot tolerate it, because it perceives the totality only in projected form, outside itself, and cannot integrate it as a subjective phenomenon. Consciousness commits the same grave mistake as the insane person. It understands the event as a concrete external happening and not as a subjective symbolical process. The result is that the external world gets into hopeless disorder and is actually destroyed insofar as the patient loses his relationship to it. The author suggests the analogy with psychosis by the delirious state of the professor.
Wait, what? What? The professor? The professor, though. The delirious state of the professor. And it destroys him. This literally reads like an explanation of the story of both Heath and the scientist professors of Scarlet and Violet, Professor Sada and Turo.
It is not only the insane person who makes this fundamental mistake, but all those who take philosophical or theosophical speculations for objective realities and consider the mere fact that they believe in angels as a guarantee that such things exist in reality.
Spoiler alert for Platinum End, that last little excerpt is the plot of the whole series, which clearly is filled with a lot of the symbology as well. But that's another video. Let me know what you think about that, and if you're interested in seeing a video on the occult side of Platinum End in the comments. And Carl Jung couldn't go without referencing the hydrogen bomb at least one more time, or speaking of a supreme, almost artificial intelligence coupled with an epistemological prophecy, proclaiming,
presumably not altogether unimpressed by 100 or more H-bombs, which might well upset its nervous system with the radioactivity, the black cloud withdraws as suddenly as it came. Nothing whatever has been learned of its contents, except that it knows as little about a metaphysical supreme being as we do. Nevertheless, its intelligence proves unendurably high for human beings, so that it comes suspiciously near to having a divine or angel-like nature. Here the great astrophysicist joins hands with the naive Angelucci. Understood psychologically, the story is a description of fantasy contents whose symbolical nature demonstrates their origin in the unconscious. Whenever a confrontation of this kind occurs, there is usually an attempt at integration. This is expressed in the intention of the cloud to remain for some time near the sun in order to feed on its energy. Psychologically, it would mean that the unconscious drew a strength and life from its union with the sun. The sun loses no energy, but the earth and its life, signifying man, lose a great deal. Man has to pay the price for this invasion or eruption of the unconscious. His psychic life is threatened with the gravest injury. What, then psychologically speaking, is the meaning of this cosmic, or rather psychic, collision? Obviously, the unconscious darkens the conscious, since no rapprochement, no dialectical process takes place between their contacts. For the individual, this means that the cloud deprives him of solar energy. In other words, his consciousness is overpowered by the unconscious. This is equivalent to a general catastrophe.
Deprived of solar energy, loss of self. Sounds to me like what almost happened to Heath could have ultimately happened to Heath, and like what is said to have happened to the professors in their respective universes of Scarlet and Violet. In the epilogue, Carl Jung adds one last supplemental story from a novel called The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which is another version of that same archetype of a dreamy encounter with a higher intelligence. But this one is possibly even more far out, adding to the Pokémon parallels with the fact that the humans in the story encounter a circle that puts them to sleep and impregnates them with morphically resonant, highly intelligent children that operate like a hive telepathically. They have golden eyes and require a special academy to be built for them by the authorities of information, who ultimately decide their intelligence is a threat and bomb them. And the circular zone sounds like Area Zero, or a time distortion zone from Pokemon Legends Arceus. But according to Carl Jung and Plato, the similarities in all these stories are both imaginary and real, psychological, approximate imitations of some true, ultimate, real, divine, archetypal, original form. Now, I'd like to add one additional passage from a bit earlier in Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, before taking notes from other sources. It talks about psychological parallelism, bringing to mind the theories of parallel universes in Pokémon. He also writes a lot about the psychic effects on matter, which seems to relate to not only the psychic type, but also special versus physical attack moves. We get numerology, sacred geometry, patterns like the fruit of life from the hidden treasure of Area Zero, and dream symbols like Heath and the professors with the disc Pokemon. It literally says these dream symbols can transcend time and space like the time machines of the professors. It's so good, I love this part.
That there is something beyond the borderline, beyond the frontiers of knowledge, is shown by the archetypes and, most clearly of all, by numbers. which this side of the border are quantities, but on the other side are autonomous psychic entities capable of making qualitative statements which manifest themselves in a priori patterns of order. These patterns include not only causally explicable phenomena like dream symbols and such, but remarkable relativizations of time and space which simply cannot be explained causally. They are the parapsychological phenomena which I have summed up under the term synchronicity and which have been statistically investigated by Ryan. The positive results of his experiments elevate these phenomena to the rank of undeniable facts. This brings us a little nearer to understanding the mystery of psychophysical parallelism, for we now know that a factor exists which mediates between the apparent incommensurability of body and psyche, giving matter a kind of psychic faculty and the psyche a kind of materiality, by means of which the one can work on the other. That the body can work on the psyche seems to be a truism, but strictly speaking, all we know is that any bodily defect or illness also expresses itself psychically. Naturally, this assumption only holds good if, contrary to the popular materialistic view, the psyche is credited with an existence of its own. But materialism in its turn cannot explain how chemical changes can produce a psyche. Both views, the materialistic as well as the spiritualistic, are metaphysical prejudices. It accords better with experience to suppose that living matter has a psychic aspect, and the psyche a physical aspect.
With all of these passages adding up, it's clear to me that Pokémon has been inspired, at least in part, by the works of Carl Jung since the start. Would you agree? Nah, I think I ended up reading most of Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, but in an effort to get this video out in a timely manner, I have not read the entirety of it, so I probably missed additional details. But thanks to Pokémon, I am adding this to my reading list along with the Red book, and please, I encourage anyone to pick up from where I left off, find more connections in these books, and leave them in the comments of this video, or even make your own video. Speaking of your thoughts in the comments, what do you think about these books? Do you think they could be a source of inspiration for the Pokemon games, and of Scarlet and Violet in particular? There is a lot in both. Carl Jung essentially outlines how he feels about humanity overall and his predictions for our future in Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. The parts I have not yet read look insane, and I can't wait to finish reading it. Before we move on to the next big historical figure in this series, there is one additional source to consider, from Carl Jung. In his letter to Bernhard Milt, which was published in the book titled Letters of C.G. Jung, Volume 1, 1906 to 1950, Carl Jung writes something that was actually the first thing that caught my attention in relation to this entire Poke theory that I am presenting in this series, led me to research his work more, and led me to discover that he had a red book like the Scarlet book of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. He writes,
You raise in your letter the question of the archetype of the self. As you rightly suppose, this archetype is not so much a working hypothesis as something that is found. There are, as I have shown, for instance, in psychology and alchemy, with the help of empirical material, typical symbols and dreams which, faute de mieux, I have called symbols of wholeness or of the self. I have also gone into the reasons for this nomenclature. I have often asked myself whether the term archetype, primordial image, is a happy one. For instance, Jacob Burckhardt applied the term primordial image to Faust, and with every conceivable psychological justification. Equally, I believe the word archetype is thoroughly characteristic of the structural forms that underlie consciousness, as the crystal lattice underlies the crystallization process.
The word archetype is thoroughly characteristic of the structural forms that underlie consciousness, as the crystal lattice underlies the crystallization process. So immediately, the term crystal lattice sent me into a parallel with terrestrial crystals. And what he's describing here is the same subject he was discussing of archetypal entities of the unconscious in his book Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. But here, he uses the analogy of the crystal lattice, depicting how there is a code and perfect structure to crystals, and how some believe the code created the crystal, while others believe the crystal created the code. Which came first, the code or the crystal? The chicken or the egg? Past or future, infrared or ultraviolet, inside or outside, conscious or unconscious, real or imaginary, fact or fiction, all two sides of the same coin. Carl Jung goes on to mention God as an archetypal light from a hermetic book that relates to alchemy, which he also mentions in the read excerpt. Funnily enough, his next words go directly into Plato, who just so happens to be our last historical figure in this series. He claims the only difference between his beliefs and Plato's is that he is stating it as fact as opposed to metaphysics. Interesting little parallel to Scarlet and Violet there with the fact and fiction themes yet again. But wait, did anyone else catch the reference to Faust? It brings to mind a lot of the other themes that keep reoccurring throughout all of these references. I mean, the Faustian idea of someone making a deal with an entity to attain success is the very story of Heath and the professors with the disc Pokémon, ultimately supposedly taking the professors' lives. Promethean flames, an end to our time in the universe caused by our own advancement in technology, like the story of Atlantis. There's another huge archetype being depicted in these games. The references that these games are making go from recent historical figures to he who shall not be named, to ancient ultimate historical figures, to the divine masculine, feminine, and self, to God, and yep, if you haven't picked up on it yet throughout the video, these games are also referencing the devil. I know, but hear me out. The concept of the divine masculine and the divine feminine meets with a legendary serpent in paradise to discover fruitful hidden treasures. Not to mention all of these references to light, which has been associated with Lucifer, the light bearer. Let's go back to flying saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, for a moment to see what Carl Jung has to say about Faust. He mentions descending and ascending as a dualism related to Faust, bringing to mind the various explorers of Scarlet and Violet descending into Area Zero. We get more fish symbology, and the totality circle being formed by dualities, antithetical opposites, and fours, like the strange symbol of the four circles on the ground in Area Zero.
The exhortation to remain below on Earth is immediately followed by the paradoxical request, carry us up to the height. One might think of the saying in Faust, then to the depths. I could as well say height. It's all the same, were it not that the dreamer has clearly separated the two processes by a hiatus. This shows that it is a sequence and not a coincidental oppositorial. Evidently, a moral process is envisaged, a catabasis and anabasis, the 7 steps downwards and the 7 steps upwards, the immersion in the crater followed by the ascent. Mephistopheles is not the whole of Faust, and the enema too is only a part of the whole, which is obscurely alluded to in the deep sea fish, the rotundum. Here the enema plays the role of the mediatrix between the unconscious and the conscious, a dual figure like the Sphinx, compounded of animal instinct, body, and specifically human qualities, head.
And
this peculiar feature of our picture recalls the fraternity discussed by Plato in the Timaeus and experienced still earlier by Ezekiel in his vision of the 4 seraphim. One of them had a human face, the other 3 had animal faces. The motif appears again in certain representations of the sons of Horus and in the emblems of the evangelists, as well as in the 4 Gospels, 3 synoptic, 1 Gnostic, and in the 4 persons of Christian metaphysics, the Trinity and the Devil. The 3+1 structure is a motif that runs all through alchemy and was attributed to Maria the Copter Jewess. Goethe took it up again in the Kabiri scene in Faust. The number 4 as the natural division of the circle is a symbol of wholeness in alchemical philosophy. And it should not be forgotten that the central Christian symbol is a fraternity too, which, in the form of the long cross, even has the 3+1 structure.
Now that the devil has been straight up referenced, could it be worth looking into what else Carl Jung has to say about the devil in this book? In the excerpts we will read, he starts out saying that basically the devil is in the details because you recognize an illusion when they don't look as you would traditionally expect them to. Kind of like the approximately similar appearance of the Paradox Pokémon with their original versions, as well as the approximate similar appearance between Pokémon and animals of our parallel real world. Next, we have our protagonists doubting their reality and if they are in an illusion, paralleling to Heath's dreamy state when encountering the disc entity. This doubt expands into the consideration that the revelation of a true reality is actually just another deception from the dude of the day himself, the devil. This also leads to a metaphor about a real meal versus a hallucination and psychic phenomenon. More symbolism of the number 6, a reference to education, a countryside, and yeah, just straight up Faustian pacts with the devil. Later, there's an elaboration on the symbolism of light relating to both Christ and the devil, dualism, fours, morality, and a description of how two opposing forces are both active in opposing each other, thus causing their conflict, but also unifying them under a shared quality of activeness and existence, as opposed to one simply existing and the other not. So they are not merely opposites in that one exists and the other does not, or one is active and the other is not, but instead both exist and are active with other opposite qualities. This moral opposition and choice can create parallel universes. As he says, it is the uniting symbol that our creation or disaster is hinged upon.
So long as the numinous contents can avail themselves, in one way or another, of the traditional forms, there is no cause for disquiet. But when they betray their archaism by assuming unusual and obnoxious features, the matter becomes painfully dubious. The saint then begins to doubt whether they are any less illusory than the delusions of the senses. Indeed, it may even happen that a revelation originally regarded as divine is subsequently damned as a deception of the devil. The criterion of distinction is simply and solely tradition, not reality or unreality, as in the case of a real or illusory meal. The vision is a psychic phenomenon, just as are its numinous contents. Your spirit answers spirit, whereas in a fast, the need for food is answered by a hallucination and not by a real meal. Quite apart from ecclesiastical symbolism, which embodies 6,000 years of spiritual development and is constantly renewing itself, there are also its more disreputable relatives, magical ideas and practices which are still very much alive in spite of all education and enlightenment. One must have lived for many years in the Swiss countryside in order to become acquainted with this background, for it never appears on the surface. But once you have found the key, you stagger from one amazement to the next. Not only do you come across the primitive witch doctor in the guise of the so-called strudel wizard, you will also find blood pacts with the devil, pin stickings and spells for drying up the milk of cattle, and regular handwritten books of magic. At the house of one of these rustic wizards, I once discovered a book of this kind from the end of the 19th century, beginning with a Mersberg magic spell in modern High German and an incantation divinus of unknown age. These wizards often have a large clientele from town and country. The extremes of emotion and effect which human nature is capable of, but which in ordinary life are prohibited, suppressed, hidden, or altogether unconscious. It is probably not without good reason that the name Lucifer applies to both Christ and the devil. The temptation in Matthew 4:3ff describes the split between them, and the fight against the devil and his angels exemplifies the mutual opposition and at the same time the interrelationship between the two sides of a moral judgment. An opposition exists only where two principles conflict with one another, but not where one is and the other not, or where there is only a one-sided dependence, such as when only good has substance but not evil. The fiery figure is ambiguous and therefore unites the opposites. It is a uniting symbol, a totality beyond human consciousness, making whole the fragmentariness of the merely conscious man. It is a bringer of salvation and disaster at once. What it will be, for good or ill, depends on the understanding and ethical decision of the individual. The picture is a kind of message to modern man, admonishing him to meditate on the signs that appear in the heavens and to interpret them aright. In Christian iconography, the Trinity consists of 3 human persons, occasionally depicted as a tricephalous, while the fourth, the devil, is traditionally represented as half animal. Our mandala seems to be complementary to the Christian totality.
This gives a whole new context to the fruit symbology, not only in this book, but also in Scarlet and Violet. Here, how Carl Jung mentions fruit thematically in line with knowledge, sexuality, and morality.
In comparative religion, we so often find the religious and spiritual aspects associated with those of sexuality, hunger, aggression, power, etc. A particularly fruitful source of religious symbolism is the instinct to which most importance is attached in a given epoch or culture, or which is of most concern to the individual. There are communities in which hunger is more important than sex and vice versa. Our civilization bothers us less with food taboos than with sexual restrictions.
While we're still talking about biblical references, here is the only quote directly referencing the Garden of Eden in Carl Jung's Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies.
Morality consequently degenerates into legalistic behavior, and the Felix culpa remains stuck in the Garden of Eden. We are surprised at the decay of ethics in our century, and we contrast the standstill in this field with the progress of science and technology.
Once again, the references to science and technology being at the center of an ethical failure after a previous golden period of time directly parallels the themes of Plato's story of Atlantis, the alleged codename of the map of Paldea in the game's code. This excerpt also directly parallels Sada and Tura's downfall via technology. Also, when you consider the fact that the main event, the climax at the end of the games, is the AI professors initiating something called Paradise Protection Protocol, it brings to mind the paradise-like description of the Garden of Eden, the strangely paradise-like valley in the Arctic in the missing diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, and of so many of the paradise-like places described throughout the stories in Carl Jung's Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. Believe it or not, more parallels with Fruit and Faust will be reviewed in the next chapter of this series on Plato. Woo! Well, that was a lot of information to get through. Congratulations, and also thank you for making it this far. Let me know what you think about all of the Carl Jung parallels in the comments. And with that, let's finally get into our last historical figure. Perhaps the oldest, wisest, and most historically influential and famous man himself. The man Carl Jung referred to so many times, who happens to hold the treasure of many more answers behind the mysteries of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet in one of his many books that have been published and read, and with vines and grapes on the cover. Plato connects us to more symbolism of the fruit from Paldea's academies. So we are coming full circle here with fruit symbolism. But also, we're coming full circle here because Plato is the master who brought us the story of Atlantis itself, the alleged codename of Paldea, and one of the ultimate stories of fact versus fiction, nature versus technology, and ethical versus unethical. Many ancient cultures have stories similar to Atlantis about the fall of a previously more advanced civilization, like the Mayans and Egyptians, who both happen to have mythologies around feathered serpents as well, like our Scarlet and Violet box legendaries and the Central American themes throughout the games. Plato is the first, however, to document the story using the name Atlantis specifically in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. But wait, there's more. So much more. So stay tuned for the next and last chapter concluding how Heath's inspirations unveil Pokémon Scarlet and Violet.